On a crisp October afternoon in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, 2 gunshots echoed through an apartment lobby. Within minutes, a man lay dead. But this wasn't random violence. This was an execution ordered by one of Canada's most dangerous criminal organizations. The victim? Sean Simmons, 31 years old. The motive? An affair that would cost him everything. Tonight, we're diving into a case where betrayal meets brotherhood justice, where love becomes a death sentence, and where the code of silence nearly let killers walk free. This is the story of how the Hells Angels decide who lives and who dies. Sean Simmons appeared to be just another working-class father in North End Dartmouth, taking his daughter to school, working construction jobs, living quietly in a neighborhood where people minded their own business. The kind of place where a man could disappear into anonymity if he played his cards right. But what was Sean hiding from his neighbors? In the 1990s, Sean moved freely within Nova Scotia's outlaw biker circles. These weren't weekend motorcycle enthusiasts. These were men whose reputations were built on fear, whose word was law, whose reach extended far beyond police jurisdictions. Sean's associations weren't casual friendships. They were dangerous alliances that came with unspoken rules and deadly consequences. But Sean had already crossed them once before. 1993. 7 years before his murder, Sean was brutally beaten by men connected to the same circles he once called friends. The assault was methodical, professional, the kind of violence that sends a message rather than just inflicting pain. The message was crystal clear. There are lines that cannot be crossed, rules that cannot be broken, and consequences that cannot be avoided. Sean survived that beating, spending weeks recovering from his injuries. Perhaps he thought that chapter was closed, that 7 years of keeping his head down had earned him a clean slate. Perhaps he believed the outlaw world had forgotten about him. He was dangerously wrong. By 2000, Sean had convinced himself he'd successfully escaped his past. He had a wife, a young daughter who adored him, and the kind of quiet domestic life that seemed worlds away from the violence he'd once known. He worked when he could find jobs, helped neighbors with repairs, and appeared to be just another father trying to provide for his family. But what Sean didn't realize was that some debts can never be paid, some slights never forgiven, and he was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Her name was Lisa Smith, and she wasn't just any woman. She was married to a Hells Angels member. Sean was having an affair with her. But why would Sean risk everything for this relationship? Was he so blinded by emotion that he forgot the deadly mathematics of biker politics? In the rigid hierarchy of outlaw motorcycle clubs, where respect is currency and disrespect is debt, Sean's actions weren't just personal betrayal. They were organizational humiliation. When someone disrespects a patch holder, they're disrespecting the entire organization, and in that world, humiliation demands blood. What Sean didn't know was that conversations he couldn't hear were already taking place in clubhouses across Nova Scotia. The kind of conversations that decide whether someone lives or dies. Neil Smith wasn't just angry. He was humiliated. As a full-patch member of the Hells Angels, Smith's authority was absolute within the organization. His word was law. His grievances became organizational priorities, and his wife's affair with Sean Simmons had become everyone's business. In outlaw motorcycle clubs, a full-patch member's personal problems don't stay personal. The decision was made with organizational backing. Sean Simmons had to die. But who would carry out this death sentence? According to court documents that would later be revealed during trial, this wasn't going to be a spur-of-the-moment killing. This was going to be a carefully orchestrated execution, planned with the kind of precision that only comes from organizational backing. Enter Dean Daniel Kelsie, a 27-year-old man eager to prove his loyalty to the club. Kelsie wasn't a full-patch member yet, but he was hungry for advancement, willing to do whatever it took to earn his place in the Brotherhood. And executing Sean Simmons was going to be his audition. But how do you lure a man to his own execution? Kelsie couldn't just walk up to Sean's front door and pull the trigger. They needed a way to get Sean alone, in a controlled environment, where the killing could be carried out without witnesses or complications. That's where Stephen Garreau came in. Garreau was perfect for the job. He knew Sean, had moved in the same circles, and most importantly, he was someone Sean trusted. Garreau had his own apartment in North End, Dartmouth, in a building that would provide the perfect location for an ambush. The plan was simple, but effective. Garreau would contact Sean, arrange a casual meeting at his apartment building, and lure him into the lobby where Kelsie would be waiting. No witnesses, multiple escape routes, and enough acoustic dampening that gunshots might be mistaken for construction noise. But this conspiracy went deeper than just three men. Wayne James, another Hells Angels associate, was brought in to help coordinate the logistics, providing weapons, arranging alibis, and ensuring that the execution would go smoothly. For weeks leading up to October 3, 2000, these men were in constant communication. Cell phone records would later reveal a pattern of calls and messages that painted a clear picture of conspiracy. They were planning every detail, considering every variable, preparing for every contingency. This wasn't the work of amateurs. This was organizational killing at its most efficient, and Sean Simmons had no idea what was coming. But were there signs he should have noticed? Tuesday afternoon, October 3, 2000. The kind of crisp October day that makes you appreciate the brief respite between summer's heat and winter's bite. Sean Simmons was going through his usual routine. Nothing out of place, no visible tension, no sign that death was waiting for him just minutes away. His daughter was at school. His partner had no reason to suspect anything unusual. To anyone watching, it looked like just another ordinary day in the life of a working-class father in Dartmouth. But in the lobby of Stephen Garreau's apartment building, Dean Kelsie was making his final preparations. The lobby was perfect for what they had planned. Built in the 1970s with utilitarian design, it had narrow spaces and limited sightlines, ideal for an ambush. Multiple exits for the perpetrator, limited escape routes for the victim, and the kind of acoustic dampening that would muffle gunshots. Kelsie had studied the layout, knew the timing, understood exactly where Sean would enter and where he would stand. Every detail had been considered, every variable accounted for. He positioned himself behind architectural features that provided concealment without limiting his mobility. Gloves on, gun loaded, calm and focused. But what was going through Sean's mind as he approached his final moments? Sean entered the building lobby, greeting Garreau like an old friend. There was no panic in his voice, no tension in his body language. He was probably even relieved that the meeting was going smoothly. Garreau was someone he trusted, someone who seemed safe to meet with. The conversation was brief and casual. Sean had no idea that every word, every movement, was being monitored by a man with a gun just meters away. He was completely unaware that he'd been led into a trap, with the precision of a lamb being guided to slaughter. If you could watch this scene unfold from above, you'd see the choreography of execution. Sean standing in the predetermined position, Garreau keeping him in place with casual conversation, and Kelsie emerging from concealment with deadly purpose. Two shots echoed through the building. The forensic evidence would later reveal the horrifying sequence of events. The first shot hits Sean in the arm, likely a defensive wound as he instinctively raises his hands, suddenly realizing what's happening. For a split second, he understands that he's been betrayed, that the casual meeting was actually a death trap. The second shot strikes him in the head, killing him instantly. No shouting, no struggle, no final words. Just sudden, surgical violence followed by deadly silence. Within minutes, residents upstairs were calling 911. They'd heard the gunshots. Two distinct reports that cut through the afternoon quiet like thunder. Something about the sharp, deliberate sound told them this wasn't construction noise or a car backfiring. Halifax Regional Police responded within minutes, their patrol cars converging on the North End apartment complex. The first responders found exactly what they expected and feared. Sean Simmons lying motionless in the lobby, blood pooling beneath his head. shell casings scattered across the floor. No weapon nearby, no sign of the shooter, but the execution, because that's exactly what it was, had all the hallmarks of professional violence. Kelsie had vanished into the autumn afternoon, but had he been as careful as he thought? The moment first responders secured the scene, it was obvious this wasn't a random killing. Sean Simmons had been executed with military precision, and the evidence was about to unravel a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of organized crime in Nova Scotia. Halifax Regional Police immediately sealed off the entire apartment building and surrounding neighborhood. Officers went door to door, questioning neighbors who had heard the gunshots, two loud, isolated cracks that had shattered the quiet Tuesday afternoon. But how do you solve a murder when nobody wants to talk? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A grainy security camera from a nearby business had captured something crucial. Sean Simmons arriving at the apartment building at 2:49 p.m., walking calmly toward the entrance like he was going to any ordinary meeting. And right behind him, clearly visible on the same footage, was Stephen Garreau, the man who had lured him to his death. Investigators enhanced the footage, analyzing every frame. The body language, the sequence of entry, the positioning inside the lobby. It was clear that Garreau had been guiding Sean into position with practiced deception. But Garreau wasn't the one who pulled the trigger. So where was the actual killer? Within 48 hours, detectives from the Halifax Regional Police Major Crime Unit had identified a pattern that would blow the case wide open. Cell phone records showed a web of communication between known associates in the hours leading up to the shooting. 4 names kept surfacing in every witness interview: Neil Smith, Stephen Garreau, Wayne James, and Dean Daniel Kelsie. The evidence against Kelsie was mounting like an avalanche. Gunshot residue, found on clothing suspected to belong to him. Microscopic particles that could only have come from recently firing a weapon. Cell phone records placing him in direct contact with Garreau and James in the hours leading up to the shooting. A digital trail that prosecutors would later call the smoking gun. Multiple witness sightings placed Kelsie in the vicinity of the apartment complex around the exact time of the murder. Independent witnesses who had no connection to each other, no reason to lie, and no knowledge of the broader conspiracy. Police executed search warrants on multiple locations connected to the suspects. What they found behind those heavily secured doors only strengthened their theory. Communications between club members discussing problems that needed to be handled. Cryptic language that investigators would later argue referenced Sean Simmons directly. Financial records showed unusual cash movements in the days before the murder. Payments that suggested the killing had been contracted rather than personally motivated. But despite the growing mountain of evidence, detectives faced a brutal reality. They were trying to dismantle a machine built on intimidation, silence, and absolute loyalty. A machine that had operated successfully for decades by ensuring that witnesses stayed quiet and conspirators protected each other. The Hells Angels didn't just kill people who crossed them. They made sure that anyone who might testify against them understood the consequences of cooperation. Would anyone be brave enough to break the code of silence? February 2001. After months of painstaking investigation, Halifax Regional Police made their move. Dean Daniel Kelsie was arrested at his residence in a pre-dawn raid. No resistance, no dramatic chase, just the quiet efficiency of handcuffs and Miranda rights. The charges were as severe as they were unforgiving: first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. But investigators weren't finished. Simultaneously, police issued identical charges against Stephen Garreau, Neil Smith, and Wayne James. This wasn't just about the shooter. This was about dismantling the entire conspiracy. June 2003. Inside the Nova Scotia Supreme Court in Halifax, the most dangerous secrets of the outlaw biker world were finally dragged into fluorescent light. For the first time, the public would hear exactly how the Hells Angels planned and carried out their brand of justice. But would the prosecution be able to prove their case? The Crown prosecutor's strategy was methodical and devastating. They assembled a chain of evidence designed to expose not just the murder itself, but the organizational structure that had made it possible. The key testimony came from multiple sources that painted a comprehensive picture of the conspiracy. Former biker associates who had walked away from the club life were now willing to expose how orders were issued, how loyalty was enforced, and how the chain of command functioned when violence was required. These weren't casual observers. These were men who had lived inside the organization, who understood its codes and customs, who could explain to the jury exactly what it meant when a full-patch member decided someone had to die. Forensic experts detailed the scientific evidence that connected Kelsie to the shooting. The gunshot residue wasn't just trace amounts, it was significant enough to indicate recent firing of a weapon. The cell phone records didn't just show contact, they showed a clear pattern of communication that accelerated in the hours before the murder. Ballistics experts testified about the bullets found at the scene, explaining how the trajectory and impact patterns supported the prosecution's theory. The courtroom listened as prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of organizational killing. Garreau had lured Sean into the building with practiced deception. Kelsie had waited in ambush with cold professionalism. Smith and James had orchestrated the entire operation from behind the scenes. The defense fought back with everything they had, attacking witness credibility, suggesting alternative theories, and trying to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that witnesses were unreliable, and that the prosecution's case was built on speculation. But the weight of evidence had become suffocating. Phone records, ballistics analysis, forensic evidence, witness testimony, each piece stood alone, but together they formed an unshakable foundation. By November 2003, the verdicts were delivered. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Dean Kelsie was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The other conspirators received similar sentences, their futures decided by a jury that had seen through their wall of silence and denial. Justice served? The story was far from over. 2008. 5 years after Dean Kelsie was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, the entire case was suddenly thrown into legal chaos. The Nova Scotia Court of Appeal overturned his first-degree murder conviction, citing a critical error that had tainted the entire trial. What went wrong? Improper jury instruction. During the original trial, the jury had not been given the option to consider lesser charges of second-degree murder or manslaughter. This wasn't just a technical oversight, it was a fundamental violation of criminal law principles that required the appellate court to act. The murder conviction collapsed like a house of cards. How could such a solid case fall apart on what seemed like a technicality? The case continued to wind through the appeals process for years. In 2018, it reached its final destination, the Supreme Court of Canada. Their decision was as stunning as it was definitive. The court dismissed an appeal by Nova Scotia prosecutors seeking to reinstate the first-degree murder conviction. Instead, the judges found Kelsie guilty of second-degree murder while upholding the conspiracy conviction. The implications were immediate and dramatic. Because of the time Kelsie had already served behind bars, he became immediately eligible to apply for parole. The man who had once been sentenced to life without parole for 25 years was now just one legal step away from possible freedom. But would he actually get out? 2020. Dean Kelsie faced the Parole Board of Canada for the first time, seeking his first real chance at freedom in 2 decades. But the board wasn't easily convinced that he was ready for release. During his incarceration, Kelsie had accumulated over 20 disciplinary infractions, incidents ranging from minor rule violations to confrontational behavior with corrections officers. For parole officers, it painted a troubling picture of someone who still struggled with authority. The board had to ask, had Kelsie truly changed? Or was he still the same man who had coldly executed Sean Simmons in an apartment lobby? Full parole was denied. 2021. Kelsie was granted limited day parole, allowing him carefully supervised access to work programs outside the prison walls under strict conditions. It seemed like a reasonable compromise, controlled reintegration with constant oversight. But the arrangement didn't last long. 2024. While on day parole, Kelsie was involved in a workplace incident where he allegedly threatened a co-worker. The details weren't immediately made public, but they were serious enough to revive old fears that his violent tendencies remained dangerously close to the surface. The parole board acted swiftly. Day parole was immediately suspended, and authorities moved toward officially revoking his parole entirely. Fresh criminal charges were filed, and Kelsie found himself back behind bars. However, by July 2024, in a decision that surprised many observers, Kelsie was granted day parole again, though under even stricter supervision and more restrictive conditions than before. What does this mean for the people whose lives he shattered? While courts debated legal technicalities and parole boards weighed public safety risks, one family lived through every agonizing twist and turn in real time. For Sean Simmons' widow and daughter, this wasn't a case file or legal proceeding. It was their life, permanently shattered by violence. Each time Dean Kelsie petitioned for parole, each time a new hearing was scheduled, each time legal delays dragged on for months or years, the wounds reopened. His daughter has now lived more than half her life without her father. 24 years of missed birthdays, holidays, graduations, and life milestones that can never be recovered. The brutal truth about outlaw motorcycle clubs is that loyalty is absolute until personal desire crosses an invisible line. When it does, betrayal is paid for in blood. And there's no appeals process, no second chances, no mercy. Sean Simmons never stood a chance. The moment he began his affair with Lisa Smith, he signed his own death warrant. One man's personal betrayal became another man's execution order. But was this really justice? Or was it something darker? Dean Kelsie pulled the trigger that October afternoon, but behind him stood an entire world built on silence, fear, and rules written in violence. A world where justice is dispensed without trials, where sentences are carried out without appeals, and where the only law that matters is the law of the Brotherhood. 24 years after that fatal afternoon in Dartmouth, this case continues to evolve. Kelsie remains under strict supervision, still considered a risk to public safety. The Simmons family continues their quiet fight for justice and closure. And somewhere in the shadows of Nova Scotia, the Brotherhood that orchestrated Sean's execution continues to operate. Watching, learning, adapting, because in their world, there are always new betrayals to punish, new loyalties to test, and new prices to be paid in blood. The question isn't whether the Hell's Angels will strike again, it's when and who will be next. What do you think? Should legal technicalities be able to overturn murder convictions when the evidence is overwhelming? Do you believe someone who orders a killing should face the same penalties as the person who pulls the trigger? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This case raises serious questions about organized crime, justice, and whether our legal system is equipped to handle the complexities of brotherhood loyalty and violence. If this deep dive into outlaw motorcycle club justice fascinated you, make sure to like and subscribe for more investigations into the dark world of criminal organizations. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the outlaw world, everyone pays eventually. The only question is when